He had his M16 on his side, and he found himself in Vietnam in a village. And when he's telling me the story, he's in a Louisiana prison. And the more he tells me the story, the more he reveals, the more intrigued I become, until he finally gets to the end of the story. And the ending was so tragic that I think I shed tears that night thinking about what happened to the little boy who was riding a bike as this veteran spilled his heart on what he had to do. You want to stick around for this one. Silent battles when military service becomes a prison sentence. Serving our country shouldn't lead to a life sentence of trauma and neglect, but for many veterans, military service becomes a different kind of prison. We're exploring in this video the silent battles veterans fight, the unseen scars, and how the system often fails those who sacrificed everything, leaving them trapped in a cycle of struggle long after their military discharge. And on top of that, they find themselves incarcerated in a United States prison. This is the story of the veterans who are incarcerated all throughout the United States of America. And I don't have a lot of notes on this. Just one little note sheet with a couple statistics that I want to share with you about veterans who are incarcerated in prisons throughout the United States of America. But specifically, I want to tell you about two men I was incarcerated with in the mid-1990s who had both served tours of duty in Vietnam. And I had a special opportunity or a haunting experience to hear the thoughts of both of these men as they shared experiences that veterans rarely and seldom share. In prison, these veterans who had served in war situations, they were in combat. They were not just stationed somewhere for training. They were in Vietnam and they experienced war and death in ways that we can't imagine. And there was no psychiatrist to talk to in prison. So you know what inmates do who are also veterans? They find themselves in a rare opportunity to speak to someone who's going to listen. And I did a good job of listening. That's why I have so many stories to tell. If you just shut this for a little while and pay attention to what people are saying, you'd be surprised on what you can learn. And the more quiet you are, the more you keep your mouth shut, the more they'll start telling you. And they'll reveal things to you that they don't reveal to anyone else. And I want to tell you the story of Billy and Marvin, two Vietnam veterans who found themselves incarcerated in the state of Louisiana. I want to set the stage for you so you can see exactly what happened and why I received so much information from Billy and Marvin. Billy was a white convict, a kind of scraggly individual, had the long beard like myself, and he had the long hair, and he was a very skinny, fragile guy, and he used to chain smoke, cigarette after cigarette, and drink coffee nonstop. He ate like a bird. In other words, he pecked his food. He didn't eat his full tray. And Marvin was the exact opposite. He was a black individual, and he was roughly about the same age as Billy. I think he might have been a few years older than him. And he was a more stocky guy. He had a little more meat on his bones, and he was clean shaven, and he looked more like a person who would be an everyday person you run into on the street, whereas Billy looked like he might have been a vagabond. Marvin looked like he can carry himself in society well and blend in. But both of them found themselves in prison for substance abuse and alcoholism. Billy was in prison for like his 6th or 7th DUI. He couldn't stop drinking. He drank every single day to drown the pain away. And it was through conversation that I learned that Billy used to take that bottle till there was nothing left, and he was passed out on a park bench or got behind a car and drove and ran into some stop sign somewhere to the police department and said, "We have to lock you up." And he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was homeless. He was just staying wherever he could stay from one place into the next. And Marvin was the exact opposite. He held a 9-to-5 job down. He had a family, but occasionally those tormenting memories of Vietnam and what happened in the Vietnam War would come back unexpectedly. And he would tell these stories that he would be sleeping in his bed and he would wake up in a cold sweat, trembling, and his wife would say, "Marvin, are you okay?" And he's like, "I got to take a walk." And when he took those walks, he would find himself in so much pain that there was nobody to confide in. And he would find himself at the trap house, at the drug house. And then he would be on a binge, smoking crack, shooting heroin. And the next thing you know, he had a substance abuse problem, binging one time after the next, until he found himself in prison with Billy. Now, neither one of them crossed paths while they were in Vietnam, but here they were, decades later, in a prison, men in their late 30s, early 40s, in a prison in Louisiana in the 90s, reminiscing and sharing about the haunting memories of the Vietnam War. Now, before I go deeper into this story, I want to take a moment to give you an understanding so you can grasp exactly what's going on in America when it comes to veterans and imprisonment. Veterans are no strangers to being incarcerated, because there's a struggle that a lot of veterans go through when they come back from war situations. They can't settle their mind because we don't know what they went through. And Vietnam was that much more chaotic. See, World War II, when the men came back from World War II, from fighting, you know what I mean, in Germany and all over Europe and in the South Pacific, they came back to the United States as war heroes. We cheered them on. We gave them hugs. We pinned medals on their shoulders. But during the 1960s, going into the 1970s, the United States was in a different atmosphere, a different setting. We were going through a revolutionary culture of hippies and narcotics, and the breakdown in the cultural system that we had in society. Many people looked at Vietnam and the people who served in Vietnam as the enemy. They treated the men who came back from Vietnam as the enemy. That's right. These men went over there to fight a war that most of them were pushed into, not out of choice, but because of a draft. And they had to go fight a battle that they didn't even understand. And when they came back, they got spit in their face. They got taunted and humiliated. And so what did you think they were going to do when they came back after fighting a war that they didn't truly understand? And Vietnam was a brutal war. Make no mistake about it. And I don't go around asking veterans, hey, man, what'd you do, man? Did you shoot anybody? Did you have to take anybody's life? Never, ever, ever do that. It's disrespectful. But if you sit down and treat a veteran with respect and you give them your ear, sometimes, and especially in prison, where the mental health experts are honestly a joke most of the time, the veterans who find themselves incarcerated need someone to speak to, need someone to talk to. And often the narcotics are off the table because the narcotics cost a lot more in prison. So these guys find themselves in a situation to where they can almost rehabilitate their mind and their heart to get away from the alcohol and the drugs. And through cigarettes, coffee, and conversation, that's when things are revealed. And I worked in the kitchen with Billy and Marvin. And it just so happened I was extremely interested in history and in war. All right. In America, 1 in 3 veterans are arrested at least once. 1 in 3 veterans are arrested at least one time in their lifetime once they come back from serving a tour overseas. 1 in 3. That's the arrest. In 1998, 56,000 Vietnam veterans were incarcerated in American prisons. And as of now, basically in 2023 was the last statistics, 181,000 plus veterans are incarcerated throughout the United States, and that's including the Persian Gulf War. That is an astronomical number that we can't even grasp. You know what I mean? It's terrible. Now, I'm sitting down, I want you, and listen, we're going to get into the story, but I want you to understand, I'm trying to paint a picture of what's going on here, man. These dudes are locked up. They don't have a way to deal with the trauma, the mental trauma, the emotional trauma, the spiritual trauma that they go through in combat. How do you think a lot of outlaw motorbike gangs or motorcycle clubs, forgive me if you're into motorcycle riding, motorcycle clubs were birthed in the United States of America through veterans of World War I and World War II? And dare I say, probably Vietnam too, when it took it off to the next level. A lot of those MCs are ex-veterans who started those motorcycle clubs. So I'm sitting there in the kitchen talking to Billy, and we're sitting there, and I already had conversations with Marvin, but this is the conversation me and Billy having. I'm like, Billy's sitting there. He just starts talking, man. He used to smoke. And this is back when you could smoke in the kitchen in prison. And he's smoking, chain smoking, back to back. And that's all he did. He drank that coffee nonstop. He drank the coffee black and he smoked the cigarettes however he can get them. And he's just there talking. He's like, yep. And I just look at him. He's like, yep. And I look at him and I'm like, what's up? And then as soon as I said that, his eyes were straight. He had that 1,000-yard stare, that 1,000-yard gaze. And he wasn't looking at anything particular because his face was empty, but he was still speaking. And so at that moment, I realized, okay, now it's time to listen. I didn't say nothing else. Billy sips that coffee, takes a puff of that cigarette. A lot of guys in prison, they don't tend to smoke with their 2 fingers here. They use their thumb, and they smoke them cigarettes like this. Takes a puff of that cigarette. He saw I was standing there with my M16, and he's got that empty gaze. I had my M16, and I had it like this, and my finger was right near the trigger, but it wasn't on the trigger, and my thumb was tapping the buttstock. Tap, 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 and it was quiet, and we was in a village, and we had just got to this village. We had only been there for a couple hours, and we were just checking the village out, making sure there wasn't no Viet Cong. And all of a sudden, I remember seeing this little boy riding his bike. And he had like a little bike, like the bike I had as I was a kid. And I'm looking at Billy, and I'm like, what's he talking about in my mind? I'm thinking to myself, like, what's he babbling about? And he says, something in me said something wasn't right. And he said, I'm watching the little boy, and the little boy smiles at me and waves. And he said, yeah, I just lifted my hand away from that trigger, and I just went. And the boy smiled, and he just kept riding around circles. He said he rode around circles, and we stared at each other. Nobody said anything. He said he couldn't speak English, and I couldn't speak Vietnamese. He said, furthermore, he said he was like 7 or 8 years old. And he said, I'm looking at him, and there's nothing strange going on, but I feel weird. And he said, out of nowhere, the boy reaches into his shirt, pulls out a grenade. He said, by the time I realized that the grenade's in the air, he threw the grenade exploded. He said, by the time the grenade explodes, I shoot the boy right in his chest. Pow! The boy flies off the bike, lands into the mud, and I'm sitting there, and all I could hear is a buzz in my ear where the grenade blew. He said, I looked at the boy, and I'm in confusion. And he said, the boy's laying on the ground, and his eyes are empty, and his face is lifeless, and he's got pools pouring out of his mouth. And just as quickly as I put 2 in his chest, he said the flies are already buzzing around him. He said there were so many flies in Vietnam. And he said, that's when I heard everything throughout the buzz in my ear. And his face, y'all, is empty like this. And the whole time he's telling the story, the only time that he stopped holding his hand like he was holding his M16 was when he grabbed that cigarette and took another puff of it. And those empty eyes picked up that coffee. He put that coffee back down, and I'm looking at him. This dude just confessed to me that he blasted a little boy who threw a grenade, and I'm just intently focused on what he's saying because I can't believe he told me this story just now. And all of a sudden, he says, I look back and all my platoon is running around crazy, and there goes my friend. He said, we were drafted together. We knew each other from boot camp. He said, I had pieces of his body all over my body. And he said he was laid out. He said, you couldn't even recognize him. He said he was just a human glob. And he said, at that moment, I realized, I think I knew what the little boy was going to do, but I didn't react in time. And I'm thinking to myself, Billy, did you see him with the grenade? Did you see him with the grenade? Did he have the grenade in his hand? And as he's talking, that's what I'm thinking. And just as quick as he quit talking, his eyes light back up and he's back to reality. He was in another realm speaking to me, but he wasn't speaking to me. I was just there. And he looks at me and he's like, man, what we having for child today? And I'm like, what we having for child? That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, dude, you need to talk to somebody. Man, this is brutal. About that time, Marvin comes walking from to the back. Billy was just a kitchen clerk. A kitchen cleaner. He just wiped the tables and he was a server. He served the food. I was a kitchen clerk. Marvin was a kitchen cook. So Marvin comes walking up to us and he's like, what y'all got going on? What's up, Billy? How's it going? They call me Milk. He's like, what's up, Milk? What y'all got, man? What y'all talking about? And I kind of just look. I'm like, I don't know. And I know that Marvin was in Vietnam too. And Billy's just sitting there. And Billy's like, I think we was just talking about Vietnam, huh? And he looks at me and I'm like, I don't know what you want me to say, bruh. And Marvin said, I got so many stories from Vietnam, Billy. You know me and you talk a lot. He said, ain't no reason to talk about that right now. And Billy's like, yeah, you right. And I'm like, man, I can only imagine the stories that Marvin wanted to say at that moment. And here I am in the midst of two men who served in combat. And I'm just a regular 2-bit criminal doing a prison sentence for being a chump. And these dudes were struggling with their mental health for what they experienced in Vietnam. You don't know what somebody's going through until you know what somebody's going through. Prison is full of men who have empty stares, empty gazes. Their eyes are empty. Their soul is broken. Veterans doing time in America. We, as a nation, have failed the men and women of the United States Armed Services. They deserve better, and we should do all we can to make sure they get all the help that they need. I don't know what happened to Billy and Marvin. And Marvin admitted later that he was with his platoon and they did some very unthinkable things to some enemies, Viet Cong, that they captured. And you want to know what's even crazier? I actually done time with dudes who were from Vietnam. In Louisiana, beside blacks and whites, there's a strong Vietnamese population. And I know a lot of Vietnamese dudes, but I was in prison with some who were first generation Americans. And they had the stories that they told about what happened in Vietnam. And so you have this blend in American prisons of Vietnamese descendants of the Viet Cong, South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese alike. And then you have the veterans who served as American soldiers, and they come together and collide inside a jail system, inside Louisiana prisons. It's crazy. Man, welcome to the Pen and the Shank, the most unusual and unique crime and prison channel experience on YouTube. Give me a like and subscribe, where this prison channel does things different than the rest of the prison and crime channels. We cover topics that many of the other channels aren't covering because they're just not as popular. But I promise you, we're growing a strong community here, and we're going to take off. There's no limit to it. And we got more stories and interviews even coming in the future as I organize the Pen and the Shank to the next level. Man, let's get it. Like, subscribe, hit that bell notification.